got all my books over there and my drawings set up. So yeah, it's kind of still got some work to go. That's a poster I designed for a show that I curated in when we were living in France. It was actually I did a show of work from the Ubapo, the experimental comics group, and you can see like a few of the artists there, Etienne Lecroix and me and Jochen Gerne. And then up on top, I don't know if you can see them there, but there's some Craig Thompson and
Oh,
Edmond Baudouin. They've had a long delayed collaborative book that they've been working on together. I'm not sure if it's ever going to see the light of day, but they did an exhibit of like how their work has influenced each other and their friendship and stuff. So that was cool.
I didn't know that Craig Thompson was influential to Boudoir.
Well, and it's a back and forth. I mean, it's more like a artist dialogue, but definitely more, Baudouin is someone who influences more than is influenced
Yeah,
by in general.
yeah. His book on his brother that the New York Review of Comics put out. It's amazing. So good.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. It's a wonderful book.
Oh yeah,
And
you worked on that, right? Did you?
I translated it. Yeah. And I wrote
Okay,
the
I did not.
introduction.
I didn't even realize that at the time, but yeah, that's right. Yeah, that book is fantastic. That's great.
Yeah, he's incredible. And that book is it's the main thing of his that's been translated. In English, I did another like one short story in an old magazine called Rosetta years ago. And I'm hoping to do some more. We've all been busy and then the pandemic has slowed everything down, but I'm in touch with New York Review Comics and eventually going to do another project or series of projects, I hope, with them. So and I would love to do some more Baudouin.
Yeah, I remember his story in that last issue of Weirdo, and that being the
Mm-hmm.
only thing of his I could ever find in English. How did you? Because you were a work from home dad, right?
Mm-hmm.
You like the primary daytime caretaker of the kids.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Jessica and I have always tried to be as, egalitarian in our relationship as possible. Um, and but starting like when we got to France, when we were in Angoulême, which is in 2012, and Jessica was juggling two book projects. She was doing the Trish Trash Roller Girl on Mars, which is a science fiction series she did originally for Dargaud, and now it's published by Super Genius, which is part of NBM, I think, and also Out on the Wire, a totally different book for a mass market about radio storytelling and stuff. Anyway, she had two book things to do, and she was also starting to do kind of doing a podcast around that first book. And I was busy too. I was working. I did this show. I was doing some public events around France and trying to get comics done and get moving on what would eventually be Ex Libris. But it started doing more and more sense for me to at that point we were living Angoulême's a little city, so I'd walk the kids to school, and when we moved there, they were 2 and 4 years old. We just brought them to France and dropped them in a French public school
Wow.
with enormous help from Pili and Brigitte, the two women who run the residency at the Maison des Auteurs. So pretty quickly it was clear that it made sense for me to be the one who would take the school, pick them up, do the groceries, do the majority of the cooking, and then that becomes sort of my full-time thing. In fact, just now my daughter's in high school now, so I have to get up at 6:30 in the morning to just get the whole household underway. And to be honest, it's a pretty exhausting year so far, school year.
Well, how did you balance doing all that stuff with being a cartoonist?
Uh, not very well. I mean, I would say like day by day, week by week, weeks can go by where I hardly do any art at all. And I feel like a total failure as an artist. But then at the end of the year, when I look back at what I've done, I'm like, well, actually, I finished a short story. There's a new foreign edition of 99 Ways to Tell a Story. Keeps on getting. There's a Taiwanese edition coming out next year. I do, occasional workshop and talk, and it adds up. And meanwhile, I am sort of chipping away at book projects that I want to do. And eventually one of them comes together and suddenly it's like, oh, actually, it's sort of everything snaps into focus in a different way.
It used to be like I would try and draw 2 pages a day, like before I was a father and stuff. And now it's like, if I have a project that's in the works it's already written and all I have to do is draw
Yeah.
it. That's when I'm happiest. And then every day you wake up and you chip away at this thing that you wrote.
Right.
That's the best. That's when I'm like, I feel fine.
Yeah.
When I'm like in between projects, I don't really know what I'm going to do next. And then I'm also trying to take care of my son and stuff. Like I'm kind of a wreck inside, you know.
Yeah, it's really easy to get a real sense of angst when that's in that condition, because it's like, you know, the extended, you know, I know it makes a difference even if you can spend, you know, whatever 15 minutes a day on something creative. That's great.
Yeah.
But when you're trying to figure out what your next big project is, and trying to, like, you know, I have a book that I'm working on, which I won't get into details on because it's too early, but I made some first steps and I got really excited, and then I hit a hard wall, and I'm just like, I don't know, do I need to walk away from this? And I've just had to put it away.
Mm.
And the last time I looked at it was like over the summer. It's probably back in August, and I just haven't had a time where I can see, you know, spending like 2 days just like doing nothing but like shifting through my notes and doodling and thinking this stuff over. Um,
But that's what you need, though. You know, I mean,
yeah, yeah.
you need
Well,
one.
what we've done sometimes is like I try to save a little money for like retreat money, and you know, Jessica and I both have done this occasionally, and just like go to the Jersey Shore and get a little Airbnb for like 2 nights or something, and that it really takes that removing yourself. But
Yeah.
that's one thing that you know, we try to do. You know, that's why residencies are so amazing. Like we're um, you know, again, being a parent kind of sucks. One thing that sucks about being a parent is that it really constricts you from having that, like, oh, I'm going to go away for 2 weeks and, you know, to go to a writer's colony or something. And a lot won't allow you to come with family. There are very few that you can do like a family residency. You know, our solution was just to pick up and move to France for 4 years to be able to do that kind of experience.
Yeah. What was that? So you got the residency in Angoulême, and they were totally cool with you just bringing your whole family and
Yeah.
living there.
Well, I mean, uh, yeah, it was, I don't know if they knew, if any of us knew what we were getting into. And I think Jessica and I have done a bunch of stuff in our lives where we look back at it afterwards, like that was insane. Why did we think we could do that? So there's two things in Angoulême. There's the festival, which is its own entity. It's actually based in Paris, and they come down just for the festival in end of January. And then around that, there's this thing that's called the Cité de la Bande Dessinée, which is like the comics village. And it started as a comics museum up on the hill in the downtown area, and then they got this actually a new building at the bottom of the hill. If you're like in Angoulême, you kind of go down to the river, and there's this kind of modernist building built over an old factory of some sort that was the first museum. And then eventually they expanded across the river to that the shade that are like old warehouses from the tobacco paper industry.
Yeah.
And that's where they have a big museum now. They've got a really good bookstore there, and the old museum is now a library, which is incredible, and a restaurant and a repertory indie film theater. And then at the top of the hill, you've got the residency, the Maison des Auteurs. So it's like a really big complex of comics related and visual, you know, narrative related stuff.
And wait, did they give you an apartment to live in with your family when you were there?
Yeah, so the residency has I don't know, 25 to 30 residents at a time, and most of them are French or European, and a certain number of foreigners. And they have maybe they're always trying to get more, but you know, when we left, they had maybe 5 or 6 apartments available. And it was kind of first come, first serve, but they would favor the foreign residents. So if you get in touch like an hour a year, you know, beforehand, like I'm going to be coming at this date and I would love to get an apartment, they'll do their best to move things around so that you can get an apartment. And if it's available, you get it for free for up to a year, which is great.
And then what happens after that year is up? You just have to start paying rent on it, or you got to find a different place?
Yeah, no, we had to move out because they had to make room for other residencies. So we went officially for a year, but we kind of knew that if it worked out at all well, especially because we were taking our kids, we would stay a second year. In the second year, we had to leave that first apartment, and again, it would have been much harder without the help from the 2 women who run the residency. They were incredibly helpful with this stuff. And willing to sort of, you know, pull strings with like their city, you know, connection. There's a small city, so everyone knows each other. So we were able to get a bigger apartment, like 2 floors, in a kind of weird, another old factory building right down the hill from the residency. There was actually like public housing. It was a pretty interesting place to live. Slightly traumatic at times. It was like really hardcore. Like there'd be, you know, very poor people with very few resources living there, a few drug addicts, a few artists, and a few. There were several women there who were like fleeing abusive spouses who would sometimes show up in the middle of the night and bang on their doors and stuff. So it was a little intense to live there.
And what made you decide to come back to the States?
Family, most of all. Like we were just thinking, our parents were all getting older. The kids were becoming very French, and that was great. But we're also like they still, they're both born in New York, and they considered themselves New Yorkers. Now they consider themselves Philadelphians, I think. But they were getting to the point where, like, my daughter, who was 8 years old when we came back, she was starting to like clearly like lose a bit of English. She was like becoming so, and well, actually both of them. So
they would be like, "How you say?" Would they do that?
Yeah, exactly.
What? So let me go back to your first. Was Highwater Books your first publisher?
No, my first publisher was Michel Vrana, who had a publisher called Black Eye Books in Canada. Started around the same time, possibly even earlier than Drawn and Quarterly. They emerged around the same time. And he was Dylan Horrocks's first publisher. He published Pickle. He published Jay Stevens, who he's actually now publishing again and doing new work.
I had him on my channel.
Oh, there, I saw that on your thumbnails there. Yeah. So Black Candy was my first book. It came out in 1998. And around that time, I got to know Tom Devlin through Jessica, because at that time, Jessica and I, we started dating around in 97, and we visited Boston a few times and hung out with Tom when he was working at Millionaire Picnic in Cambridge. And it was weird. It was very casual how I started getting published, because every step of the way, really, because I kind of fell into being a cartoonist as a vocation. I started it as a sort of passionate hobby. I just became really fascinated with I'd always liked doodling and drawing, but I didn't go to art school. I did comparative literature as an undergrad, but I was getting into film, and I had a bunch of I'll rewind a little bit, because I didn't read comics much as a kid. I read Tintin. I read my parents' Bernard Cliven collections, the Cats books, and Never Eat Anything Bigger Than Your Head, and Whack Your Porcupine, all those wonderful books. They were pretty subversive. I was looking at them when I was like 8 or 9 years old. I think they might have rearranged my genes a little bit. And it wasn't until I went to boarding school, and I remember in our dorm in the basement, I found a box full of like vintage, like late 70s heavy metals and National Lampoons from like those sort of the best eras of both of them. So I was like, in my mind, instantly blown by, Mobius and Bilal and all those French kind of masters of the 70s. And, all the National Lampoon stuff didn't jump out at me quite as much, but, definitely all that humor comics stuff from that era. And then I discovered Crazy Cat when that first Crazy Cat, the Art of George Harriman paperback came out from Abrams back in like the late 80s, I want to say.
Patrick McDonald?
Patrick McDonald one, yeah. So it was just like piecemeal bits like that. And then I was in Ann Arbor. I got my undergrad at University of Michigan, and I'd already been kind of doodling and doing some, one-page comics on my own. And I met Terry Laban. Have you ever talked to him? You remember Cud?
Yeah.
And he was in Ann Arbor and doing political cartoons for the local paper. And I got to meet him, and he told me all about, I'd never heard of mini comics. And he's like, oh yeah, you just, you can just photocopy it and send it to people. And he gave me a couple of copies of Fact Sheet 5.
Oh yeah.
And another thing that's completely forgotten now, called Comics FX. I think it was out of Seattle, and it was like just like a newsprint comic zine that came out every month, like a broadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
And that was enough to sort of get me just like obsessed with making mini comics and sending them to these magazines. And I started hanging out every week. I would meet up with Terry and with Matt Feazell, who's the guy who created The Amazing Cynical Man.
Yeah, of course. Wow.
And really, really the great innovator of the mini comics format. I mean, there were zines before him and stuff, but he really codified that little, quarter sheet, black and white, single sheet stapled format. So that was like my cartooning school, was hanging out with those guys and drinking coffee, and usually just like doodling in our sketchbooks and occasionally showing each other work. Terry was just starting to get published by, I think it was initially Last Gasp or Kitchen Sink that did his series Unsupervised Existence, and then he switched over to Fantagraphics.
Yeah. So you had already kind of built up a name for yourself from doing mini comics by the time Black Ops?
I mean, a name. I mean, yeah. My stuff was reviewed in Factsheet 5 and Comics FX and a couple of other there was a couple other news, like, bulletins that would come out back then, kind of like what Frank Santoro is doing now, sort of trying to revive that little newsletter kind of thing. There's a guy called Clay Geddes. I don't remember that much about that guy at all, but that was like, he was pretty big at the time. There were a couple of things like that. And so I would get reviewed, like Roy Tompkins, who's now a good friend of mine. He used to do a newsletter called Fruit of the Tomb. And his stuff, like his early mini comics, he has one called, well, the original Harvey the Hillbilly Bastard, who became a character later in his comics for Fantagraphics. He did a little mini comic with his Harvey, I think where he introduced that character, that was so funny and weird and hilarious, but so different from what I was doing or even attempting to do. So it was really exciting when I got his newsletter and he had written up one of my early mini comics and saying, "Hey, this guy's really really clever and doing cool stuff." So, but a few years later, kind of out of the blue, I think I got a I don't even know if it was an email or maybe like a postcard or something. It was like in the early 90s when like emails just started to become kind of a thing. So Mark Wiedenbaum reached out to me, who was an editor then at Pulse magazine, which used to be at Tower Records in-house magazine, and Adrian Tomino was doing a monthly like vertical like mini strip for them. A lot of what, I think some of that was reprinted in later Optic Nerves, but Optic Nerve was taking off, so he dropped that gig, and I did one fill-in comic for that. And again, Mark had just seen some of my mini comics, I guess, through these other zines, and that was a really a real crossroads for me, because it was the first time I'd been paid to do a comic. It's a little black and white comic called House Music. And Mark loved it, and I got something like I believe I got, it was like 1995, and I got $500 for it.
Wow!
And it was just a little vertical strip, because this is pre-dot-com boom. This is a time in the mid 90s where there was so much money in media in general, especially on the West Coast, and especially so magazines were getting all this money because of all the computer money, the web, the dot-com money that was coming in. So there were like all these magazines, all these art directors with huge budgets, and they were paying huge amounts of money to do illustrations. So it was a crossroads, but a kind of a double-edged sword one, because I suddenly was like, I can get paid making comics. This isn't just a hobby. I can actually do this. And then Mark actually liked that comic so much, he bought the original art. And then Mark, really changed my life, because a couple months later, he gets back in touch. I didn't take over for Adrian on that thing, but I ended up doing several more comics, full page color comics for the Flip Side, which is the back page comic series, which I wish they would do a collection sometime. I was bugging Mark about it, but I don't think it's going to happen, because that's where I first saw Frank Santoro. Tom Hart was in there, all kinds of cartoonists from like that mid 90s era. And, Justin Green did a regular strip in there.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mark calls up a few months later and he's like, "Hey, would you be interested in doing like illustration for our classical music Pulse?" Because there were actually two free magazines of Tower Records at the time. There was Pulse and there was Classical Pulse. And so I would do these like postage stamp portraits of different composers or, conductors for the classical magazine. I worked with great art directors there. And again, these are like postage stamp size things. They would take me like an afternoon to do, and I was getting like $350 a pop.
Oh my
And I was like, oh my God, this is great. I'll do illustration. I'll make lots of money doing that, and I will be able to do comics however I want to do them.
Mhm.
Um, and it really set me on a very unrealistic path of like thinking of where I thought I was going to be today, like today in 2022, for example. I mean, I have no complaints overall, but it was definitely like 1997, I guess, was that whole thing just like burst, and like half those magazines disappeared overnight, and the ones that stuck around, they like lowered their pay rates, and it suddenly became like, well, just another kind of grind of a job where, um, I was constantly beating the pavement trying to get more work, getting postcards printed up, that I would send out to art directors that would rarely lead to work, and so on. And eventually I burned out and I stopped. I actually got in the New Yorker. I probably had 4 or 5 illustrations in the New Yorker in the early 2000s.
Wow.
And it was so much, it was great to be in there, and my parents were, like getting from my parents, like accepting me at like choosing the artist path of life. When I got my first illustration from Steve Heller in the New York Times book review, that was like a big deal. Like, oh, this is a real thing you're doing,
Yeah.
even though that was $150 even back then. I mean, the New York Times was never paid well. Um, but I loved working with Steve Heller. That was really great. And then getting the New Yorker, was also cool. But it was a lot of work, and I thought it would pay more than the other magazines, and it really doesn't. I also thought once my stuff was in the New Yorker, other art directors would be calling me and like giving me lots of work. That didn't happen either. Um, the best thing that happened out of all my, several years of doing New Yorker illustration is I saw Chris Ware at, a Comic-Con around then, and he walked up and he said, hey man, I really liked that illustration you did in the New Yorker. And I was like, oh wow,
Yeah, yeah.
getting a compliment was Chris was nice, but it wasn't enough to keep me doing it. So
Well, how long was the book that you did for Black Eye? Was it actually a graphic novel or was it a comic book? I've never seen this one before.
it's it's somewhere in between. It's like 60 pages. It was published as a perfect bound. I'll show you.
Oh,
Get my earlier books down here.
okay.
So it could have been stapled clearly, but we wanted to do it as a little, as a perfect bound book.
Very 90s design too.
Yeah, that's Michelle. Michelle's a great designer. He went on
Yeah.
to do work for like I think it was like a Star Wars, some kind of like Disney Star Wars magazine for many years, doing art direction and stuff. But I really like what he did with it. Yeah, I mean, one critique I got at the time, I mean, this book got very little attention, but one guy who, he wasn't so much critiquing the content, but he was saying, I would have preferred this like as a long story in an anthology or like in a collection of more stuff. He felt like it was, not enough bang for the buck, I guess. But so that story that came about because I'd moved from Ann Arbor down to Austin, Texas, and I got to know a bunch of cartoonists there. Comics Journal was doing a series of like roundtable interviews where they would get young cartoonists in different towns to do a kind of group interview. And I ran a few pages from that in there, along with some other mini comic stuff. And Michelle actually called me at home. He got my phone number. And I'd already, I'd been reading Pickle, and, Dylan Horrocks is a big inspiration to me. And called me up. He's like, "Hey, I saw that page. What is that? Do you have a publisher for that?" And I was like, "No, it's my new book. I'm just finishing up now." And he's like, "Well, I want to publish it," without even having read the thing, which uh, but yeah. So that's how that came about. And I was like, "Wow, that I'd applied for a Zurich grant and didn't get it, and I'd been really, I didn't know how I was going to get this thing published. So to have him call me out of the blue was pretty amazing. And then a couple years later, similar thing happened with Tom Devlin, where we were at this hanging out at the comic book store. He was a big fan of Black Candy, one of the few, I have to say. But he's like, "What are you working on now?" And he's like, "Well, I said, "Well, I have a new book that I'm working on about halfway through," and he's like, "Well, I'll publish it." I'm like, "Okay, that was easy."
Yeah.
And that was Odds Off, and did I get that down here? That came out in 2001.
Mhm.
Again, to very little fanfare. but it's a book that's found its followers over the years. I occasionally get well, it's been a while, but I would occasionally get really nice letters about it from people who found it in a used bookstore somewhere. So that was 2001. At that point, I was also working on the Exercise and Style project, which I started putting online. And actually, now that I think of it, it was another weird happenstance where my now agent, Bob Mikoy, called up Jessica because they had met. Jessica's dad is actually a literary agent who works with like mystery authors and stuff. And so he had introduced us to Bob at one point early on when we were like, had no clue what an agent does or why we would even want one. And he took us out for a drink and we talked a little bit. And I didn't really think much was going to come of it, but he was talking to Jessica about something, I guess about La Perdida, which she was finishing up at that point. And he asked her what I was working on. And we were like sitting in the room together, but I wasn't even on the phone with him. And Jessica was like, "Oh, he's doing this like Exercise and Style where he does the same comic over and over again in different styles." And he says, and over the phone, he's like, "Sounds great. Tell him I want to represent him and sell the book." So I've had a bunch of weird things like that where just like the timing worked out, where people who are sympathetic to my work, which in retrospect I appreciate more than ever, because it's it's very hard to find those people out there that are not only like your work but are willing to like put themselves put their skin in the game.
Well, that's amazing. Who is the publisher for 99?
It's Penguin, but it's this imprint called Chamberlain Brothers, which was only around for about 6 months. I think my book, they did 99 Ways to Tell a Story and maybe 10 other books. A bunch of them were like, it was sort of like history and biography. And I also think they did a few of those like quickie, right-wing issues books even, or something like that. I don't know. It was a weird kind of imprint. And it was just that Bob knew one of the younger editors there and kind of strong-armed him, like, "You should publish this book. It's gonna be really good. You should do this." And they took it. Within a year, the book was out. The imprint folded. The guy who had started it, I think, was I don't know if he was arrested, but he was caught. He was like embezzling funds from Penguin. They went into his office after he left, and they found like stacks of like unsigned contracts and checks and all kinds of stuff. It was a big, kerfuffle. So I'm lucky. I'm lucky that it came out, and I'm also lucky that being tough. Penguin, it's like all these years later, it's in its 22nd printing. It's still out there. It's still available.
Oh, I was going to say, because it seems like something that would be difficult to get a publisher to take on now because it's so experimental. And I feel like people are very shy about taking on things that are.
Yeah, well, same then. I mean, they bought it on the argument that it was a writer's reference book. And that's why, I mean, that's why the cover is so kind of dull and textbook like. And this was part of the double-edged sword again of doing with Penguin is it's categorized as a creative writing book. I had to fight to get it even put like / graphic novels, whatever. But it was shelved, when it was in stores, it was shelved in the writing reference section, not in the comics section.
Okay.
So weirdly, it's found obviously it's found an audience over the years. It's taught in a lot of classes, and at this point, a lot of comics classes, but it had much less of an impact in the comic scene. Like it wasn't really sold in comic book stores when it came out,
But that's okay. I mean, it's selling.
Yeah.
It has an
audience. I mean, yeah, I'm always aiming for a broader audience, but that's not to say I don't want my stuff sold in cool indie comic book stores. But
was that the first time you got into like experimenting with like the formal structure of comics and?
It was the first time deliberately. Yeah, I mean, I'd been in some of my earlier. I did a mini comic series called Terrifying Steamboat Stories that I did 4 issues of in the early 90s, and those were like, that was just like me trying to find you were talking about like, having your line and trying to figure out what to do, which is something I'm still working on. But there's also like there's a kind of a register, a kind of like a way of telling stories or creating, creating comics that like I was looking for. So like those early comics, there's some like fiction short stories, there's some dream, just like comics of dreams. There's some like folktale stuff, and it's fun at the time, like even like Dan Clowes was doing that. I remember there's some 8 Balls where he's like, I'm gonna do some Irish folktale or something like that, like just sort of trying out different stuff to see what sticks. That's like I never would think of like Dan Clowes as like a folktale cartoonist, but that he did do that at one point. And I was definitely inspired. The early 8 Balls were a big inspiration. So discovering Exercise in Style, so the French book by Raymond Queneau, and I was working in a bookstore in Ann Arbor. This would have been 92 or 93. And a friend gave that to me, and I instantly was like, oh, this is amazing. I really connect with this, the kind of the formal play, the playfulness, and also the experimentation, which like that combination is what really grabbed me. And I knew right away that I wanted to make a comics version of it, but that I wasn't ready. I had to like, just work on my basic chops for a few more years. And I should have waited even longer probably, but I was probably I started drawing this in 98. And at that point I was like, all right, I know I'm never going to be the perfect artist I want to be, but it's enough to get this thing started. And I just started working on it at that point. And yeah, it was like really, as soon as I started working on it, I was like, this, not only am I happy with doing this project, I know it's good. I know certain people are going to, react to it really well. And I know that it's like, I found my voice as an artist. Like this is like a way into the kind of art that I want to be making.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that I want to do nothing but that kind of like variations on a theme, although it is something I come back to a lot. But the combination of having a play, like a rule that forces me into a very tight situation that I got to like, figure my way out of, sort of puzzle like, is something that really appeals to me and really, I feel like produces good work out of me. It's not a shortcut because it's actually harder even than when I was writing, just making stuff up as I went along. But it's a very rewarding kind of labor to kind of figure out these puzzle structures, like to do a story as a palindrome, or to do, like my story Bridge, where it's like every page 10 years go by, and I had to figure out how to fit that into a narrative structure.
What was the comic you did before Ex Libris? Was it Drawn Onward, the retrofit comic?
Uh-huh.
That was the last
Yes.
one you had done?
Yeah, that book is so fraught for me because that was the book I started when our daughter was born in 2007. 99 Ways to Tell a Story had come out in 2005, and I'd had a French edition and a Spanish edition in rapid succession, and had been able to go over and travel and do book stuff. So I was really high on all that, and I was like, oh, it's so great, I got to keep going, do my next comics. I just as kind of like palate cleanser, I'm going to do a quick little experimental comic. I have this idea to do this palindrome kind of thing. Started in 2007. Ended up being published, I think, in 2013. It just like everything ground to a halt. It was harder. I mean, definitely at a creative level, it was a very thorny thing to figure out, to tell a story where everything is like mirrored. Bring it down here.
I love that comic, Matt.
Thank you. Yeah, and I'm happy that it came out. I love this Box Brown came up with this cover design, which I really like too. So yeah, if anyone hasn't seen it before, every page has a mirror image in the back. And actually, that was another Box idea, was to make the front and back cover in negative. Mm-hmm. So there's more to it than that. But anyway, it just like, we moved to France. We were also doing the Best American Comics series at that time, which we did for 6 years, I guess. And we had so much on our plate. So, I try to be forgiving to myself in retrospect. But at the time, it felt it's like really crappy that I had this 32-page comic where it was only 16 drawings that I had to just trace over and redraw. If you look at it a certain way, and it took me so incredibly long to finish it. But yeah, that was so. 99 Ways in 2005, Drawn Onward This was in 2013, I think. It was actually published first as a subscription only short story series called One Story, and that was really exciting. That was a friend that I met on tour, on a book tour, named Hannah Tinty, who's a short story writer, and she's now the host of Selected Shorts, the NPR show. And she started this magazine called One Story. That's each issue is one short story. And I was the first, and I think to date only comic in that series. It's mostly like it's sort of a bush leagues for like New Yorker short story writers and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So yeah, by the time we got to France, I was feeling really, and the reason why, for me, it was really important to just get out of the country and do this residency idea, as crazy as it was with the kids and leaving our whole life behind in Brooklyn. I was feeling so burnt out from teaching at SVA, especially because I was doing undergrad and continuing ed, often doing 4 or 5 classes a week, 3-hour classes, also doing sometimes like weekend, continuing ed seminars, the textbooks, the best American comics. And I could see that I was becoming known as like, oh, Matt Madden, that guy who, he used to be the editor of the best American comics, and I mad at him because I never got in or whatever,
Yeah.
or like the textbook or the teacher guy or whatever. And I was like, all these things are meant to support my vocation, which is making comics. So moving to France was like a gamble to like shift the weight of my work back to being a cartoonist.
I think I asked a question about that. Like, I
Yeah.
wondered if there was like an anxiety of all these other occupations overwhelming the identity of being a cartoonist. Like, if you would worry about people thinking of you less as a cartoonist as like an instructor or a teacher, because you did those 2 textbooks
Yeah.
with Jessica that are pretty well known.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm very proud of those works, and I like doing different kinds of stuff, especially teaching. It's more a question of like proportion, and that's where I was at in 2012, was feeling like the comics side of me, of my identity, is just getting like subsumed in all this other stuff that I'm doing.
Mhm.
And I need to sort of push back and be like, no, I mean, yes, I'm a cartoonist who teaches. I'm not a art teacher who occasionally puts out a comic book, that
Yeah.
kind of flipping that balance a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, and the truth is, I really, I did kind of burn out on teaching, at least in a sort of semester school structure, and I haven't really gone back to it. I still give a lot of workshops, and I really enjoy doing that. And I've started now doing kind of one-on-one comics coaching for people who are like working on longer projects and want, an outside eye to look at stuff. And that stuff's very rewarding to me, and I can make it fit with my schedule and my parenting duties and all this stuff, to leave me time to still make comics.
I think I told you this at SPX. I should have anyway. I really love this, and this is great.
Thank you.
And
Yeah, you did say that then too. I appreciate it.
I was wondering about how you came up with, because it's all so many different styles. How did you decide which one was going to be the default? This is the reality style.
Mhm. Well, this is something I thought I struggle with a lot, and it relates to what you were saying earlier about the line thing, where like, over the years, my whole comics career and my my vocation as a cartoonist, I see as a trajectory towards some kind of style that I haven't reached yet. I want to envision myself at like 65 years old drawing like Saul Steinberg, like a really much more simple graphic style than I have now. But I keep on finding that the stories I'm telling, are looking, to me, seem to want a more relatively realistic style of drawing. So like even in exercise and style, the basic template style that I drew is a kind of, generic indie comics realism, I would say. It's not like super, rendered. It's basically line and black. There's no hatching or anything like that, but it's like the proportions are basically realistic.
Let me interject a question here real
Yeah.
fast. Do you think that the somebody who's into reading comics would recognize your style, like that style like, just the basic style that you use normally? Do you think people would see that and immediately associate that with you?
Uh, Only because I've heard people say that. I think I don't really think of myself as having a base style because I am always using different styles to tell each story.
Mm.
And like Drawn Onward looks very different from uh, from Bridge, which is done in much more of a simple.
Yeah.
I really like this is I really like the drawing in I'll show you my favorite in this book. And I really worked at simplifying it and getting a more graphic black and white style and using this sort of like horizontal, vertical line kind of effect. That's very different from
All
what's
of it
going
is.
on.
I mean, Matt, I think I can always tell what your drawing style. Like I can always tell that something was drawn by you.
Yeah,
Even in this book, even though you're working in different styles, I can still tell that it's still you doing each.
absolutely. No, I think you can look at Tales from the Crypt page and be like, oh, Matt Madden drew that. And again,
Yeah,
there is that line thing where like even when I'm directly copying,
yeah,
a Jack Davis drawing or something, you can still see the certain wobble to my hand and the certain awkwardness or whatever. It's
yeah.
I think it was Chris Ware said it, but I think he got it from somewhere else. That like style is the accumulation of your mistakes.
Right, right,
And
right.
I think there's some truth. That speaks to that thing about that characteristic way of drawing. Like Gary Panter's wobbly line. It's like that's something you lean into and you learn to make that part of your style.
Well,
And I
like the average, the current, the story. I'm trying to figure out how to describe the sections of this book, but like I guess the narrator story in it, when you're seeing that style, that's very Matt Madden to me. That's like that to me is like your basic style. Yeah,
yeah, this kind of stuff.
and
Yeah,
just
I think so. I mean, I'm happy with how it looks, and it's very much it's fairly I'd say it's more European than mainstream American style. I don't really trace it back to any one cartoonist. I mean, it's funny because when I started, I was looking at Chester Brown, Dan Clowes, Julie Doucet. Carol Swain was a huge influence. I don't know if you know her stuff, but she's amazing. You can see that like in when I do brush like this kind of stuff, I see the like in Drawn Onward has that more charcoaly, Julie Doucet style, and Baudouin and Bletch and all those guys too. Um, but I like a kind of clean line. And in fact, so the base style for Ex Libris, I think, comes out of what the style I came up with in Drawn Onward, because Drawn Onward has like a comic within a comic, basically, and you see the sort of narrator, and she's a cartoonist, and you see her telling her story. And then when we switch to these inkier brush pages, those are meant to be the comics that she's drawing with like a expressionist dry brush style. But I found, and I came up with that line style to just distinguish from the brush stuff, which comes a bit more naturally to me. But I actually found that I liked that clean, nib drawing style, and so that evolved into the sort of base style for Ex Libris. And then the color was easy too, because when I realized I had to have color in the book, and I've never done, this is my first full color book, which has been exciting. I pretty quickly decided on a monochromatic color scheme with this sort of blue thing.
why?
And I don't know,
Why,
I did
why blue? Have you
just because it's neutral and it falls in the background. It wasn't really much more than that. But there's a very funny, I did a YouTube interview with Menachem Lukens at I'm blanking on the Escape Pod, his comic book store in Long Island.
Yeah,
And it was me, him, and Tom. And he was gently ribbing me the whole time about like, oh, you're using indie comics blue style. And he was saying it's like, and it's true, it's like Fun Home, and there's a bunch of books if you look at that have that kind of the monochromatic and blue, or like the pastel green of Ghost Swirl. There is a certain indie house style aspect to it.
That's fine. That's nothing wrong.
Which is fine. The fact is, it's like it could have just been a gray. 20 years ago, it just would have been black and white. Anyway, it would have been grayscale.
Yeah.
But it's so easy to do some color. Why not take advantage of it?
Let me ask one more question, Matt. Is this supposed to be? Is this Mark Bell or Julie Doucet? This style?
It's more Julie Doucet. It's Julie Doucet with a bit of avant-garde Polish or Slavic styling in there. But I
Okay.
could, yeah, I could see a bit of Mark Bell in there too, for
I was
sure.
thinking like, yeah, like early Mark Bell, like his like
Uh-huh.
his early mini comics or something, you know. I was like,
Yeah.
I love that panel so much. It like it stopped me in my tracks and it's
Oh,
like
thank you.
like
Yeah, that was fun to draw.
and I mean, you must have been like looking at your own bookshelf and stuff, trying to pull off who am I going to rip off for this section of the.
Right, right. Yeah, it was, some of them were tough because I would have stories that I knew were going to be in a certain style, like the Library of Terror, which is like an EC Comics thing, the Mulata de Cordoba, which is a story that I'd already drawn. And so partly it was just like splitting the difference, like what fits here that's like different enough that it's going to stand out from these other two styles. Um, but I also had a list of like genres and artists and styles that I wanted to fit in there, and definitely Julie was one that I wanted to get in there.
Yeah.
I've been putting her name in just at a kind of like fall as like an empty protest for the Angoulême festival for years, and the fact that she's actually going to be the president of this next festival blows my mind. I'm so excited about it, and looks like I'm going to be there because the French, so Ex Libris came out in Spain in this past spring, and the French edition is coming out from L'Association in February. So we're actually doing like a pre-release, signing event at the festival.
Are they keeping the same design or are they redesigning it?
They're they're slightly changing the cover. It's the same drawing, but they're changing the colors. They're simplifying the colors because their sort of house style, it tends to be more simple.
Mhm.
The Spanish edition looks exactly the same as the Uncivilized. But the ASO one is going to be a different color scheme, different typography, and a little bit smaller. Actually, more like what I had originally envisioned. Tom wanted to go like really big and have this enormous hardcover, which I'm very happy with. But the ideal size for me might even actually be a little bit smaller than what we have here. So
Yeah. What size were you envisioning the book to be? Like a
uh
6 by 9?
no, not that, no, really like maybe like an inch smaller all around. So just like kind of like let's see if I have any of those around, like a lot of the association paperbacks that they do. So no, just a little bit smaller. Just a matter of degree. It's not, I definitely don't, it needs to be a pretty large book. And I think it works. I put a lot of work into this, the art in this, and I'm glad that like seeing it, some of these are like full size of the drawing. There might even be some that are bigger than the original drawings. Like definitely this Mulata de Cordoba story was drawn smaller than what you're seeing here. And it looks great. I'm at this stuff.
Was there were there like any short stories that you were working on that just got enveloped into this book?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that one argument for doing this book, which I vacillated for a long time. I've had this idea for a long time, and I wasn't sure if something so like archly, self-referential would people would want to read it. I also, ironically, because it's so common now, but I was worried about the first person point of view that appears in most of the book. It felt like it would, like Orson Welles couldn't do it when he tried to make Heart of Darkness as a first person film. So who am I to try and do it? But in the years since I first came up with the idea, first person shooters and video games have become so common that we're like culturally much more used to that. Like no one's commented on it one way or another, that it's like through the eyes of the character.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. But yeah, partly I was thinking like this is a way I can fold in a bunch of short stories that have similar themes into a larger narrative, since short story collections are notoriously hard to package and sell, which is weird because pretty much everyone loves short stories. And when you go to school and you take a writing class or an English class, you're reading, Borges and Hemingway and all this stuff, short stories. But they're really hard to get people to pay attention to. So definitely I would say 3 or 4 of these stories were just reprinted, whole hog from earlier versions. Like that Mulata de Cordoba, I did as a little self-published mini comic. I like on my inkjet printer at home, and that's actually that's actually the comic that got me into the New Yorker. I sent that to like art directors at the New Yorker and a couple other people in the early 2000s, and that got their attention.
But yeah,
That's
you
fine.
should. I mean, you have so many short stories that I feel like you should have a collection of your
Mm,
work put together at some point. I mean,
well, Just you wait, because in fact, my next book with Tom with Uncivilized Books will be a collection of all of my uncollected,
Oh, that's
well, the best of my uncollected short comics from, from the really the oldest one, including that one House Comics I was just talking about that Mark Wiedenbaum commissioned all those years ago. I think that'll be the oldest thing in there. There'll be a couple of really old things, but mostly stuff I've done in the last 15 years that have appeared in places like Rosetta and Blurred Vision, and anthologies that were usually only read by the contributors to said anthology. So we'll see. It's short story comic collections are like I said are a hard sell, but I'm hoping that with coming on the heels of Ex Libris and with 99 Ways still being out there, there'll be some synergy there to get people to pay attention when it comes out. But at this point, we're looking at spring 24 just because of I'm ready to go to the print within a week. Everything's ready to go, but it's more about fitting it in into the Uncivilized program.
yeah.
So
Oh,
I'm
that's
hoping
fantastic.
maybe if someone gets COVID and they can't finish their book, I'll be able to slot in a bit earlier.
Well, that's interesting because the COVID thing is that must have been kind of a nightmare, right? You finish this book and then all of a sudden the world shuts down.
It actually worked out okay because I finished drawing. I actually did finish drawing it in officially in February 2020. And at that point, I sent it around to a few publishers, including, I'm pretty sure I sent it to Tom, but it didn't make it onto his, in his slush pile. And nothing was going on. I'd already spoken to l'Association, and they were down to do it. So that whole year, and then we were in lockdown and nothing was happening at all. So that whole year, I was able to just massage the book, go through and just make sure everything was really, I've never had so much time, leisure to just make sure it's exactly the book that I want it to be. We found one typo in the whole book, and there's nothing I've gone back and thought, oh, I can't believe I made that gaffe. It holds up, I think. So that was good. I had the extra year, and then in February of 21, I nudged Tom about it again. Hey, did you see this? I sent this to you a while ago, and he's like, oh, I never saw it. This is great. Can I publish this? And I was like, yes, I've been waiting for a publisher, and I've always thought that Tom and I are pretty compatible, and I have known him for years, but this is the first thing he's published by me. But and it's been great working with him. We've had a really good time of it. So, and I did benefit. So it was February 21, and one of his projects had fallen through for the fall. So we signed the contract in March, and the book came out it was supposed to go out in October. Then the other thing was the whole supply chain thing. So what didn't happen to me is the thing where your book comes out in the fall of 2020 and nobody's going to, all the book events are canceled. The book came out in November 21. So things were kind of starting to open up a little bit. I did an art show at Partners and Son, which is this wonderful shop we have here in Philadelphia, which opened up also right as the pandemic was starting, but has done amazing work and having regular shows and events. And I got to go out to Minnesota and hang out with Tom and do the Twin Cities Book Festival, which is happening actually this weekend, I think, which is a long-standing literary festival organized by Rain Taxi. So I actually got to do a few events, and I did a virtual panel for SPX, and so I didn't feel that disappointed. I was prepared for a lack of opportunities and events, but I felt given the circumstances, I did a few events, a couple of in-person things. I did before the book came out, I got to do the Carousel reading series in Brooklyn with Bob Skoriak, and that went over really well. So I was pretty happy with it, and the reaction's all been really good. Where the first print run is almost sold out, so we're going to go back to print. So yeah, for a kind of weird, again, sort of offbeat experimental comic book, I can't really complain. It's going great.
Great. Well, yeah. Well, that's exciting, man. I'm looking forward to the short story collection because I love all that stuff. The old alternative comic books that you did.
Yeah, Fine Mass, a bunch of stuff
Yeah.
Some of that stuff's in there. Yeah.
So yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate you giving me this time.